Hi, this is a short story written and narrated by Jules Williams. This story is particularly written to throw light on the plight of the so called immigrant workers in India during the COVID outbreak. I said so called immigrant workers because these are Indian citizens, and due to the sudden lockdown, many of the laborers that came from different states to big cities were suddenly jobless. They could not pay their rent and they had no money to carry on with their day to day existence. So, thousands upon thousands of workers decided to go back to their villages and thought it would be better to go home and breathe their last, either due to the illness or lack of food. But their desire was to be with their loved ones. And this is just one story depicting what it might have felt like for someone like Gopal to leave everything amidst the crisis and go back home. The setting is the city of Bombay, India, in May 2020. The title of the story is The Courtyard. Gopal started to walk home. Well, it wasn't really a house of any sorts. It was just a small room. Yes, it was a small room, but that was his home. Because a home, irrespective of its size or the material it's made up of, is a place where one can rest, sleep, dream, eat, and have some privacy. That's the place you laugh, and that's the place you cry. And in this little house of his, this little room, there was a charpai. A charpai basically is a mat. And he lived with his friend there by the name of Mahesh. Today, it was an odd day. Everything seemed to have changed so suddenly. Gopal was tired. He was so tired and so exhausted from the circumstances that if you looked at him, you wouldn't believe that he was just 35 years old. He looked more like a man in his late 50s. He kind of just stumbled to the door of his little room. Gopal knocked at the door and Mahesh opened it. Gopal looked around and saw that Mahesh had already packed up his belongings, already all set to leave. They were ready to leave to go back home to their village. In the corner by the stove, there was a plate of boiled rice. There were no lentils or no vegetables to go with it. But Gopal was hungry and he just swallowed up that rice, realizing as he ate that there was no salt in it. But that didn't matter. Right now, all that Gopal wanted to do was pack and be ready to leave, head towards his beloved village, to his parents and his siblings. Having quickly eaten, Gopal washed his hands and started to pack his belongings. He just gathered his shirts and pants. He had only a couple of each, along with his toothbrush and a pair of old shoes. He tied them up in a sheet. He didn't have any money to buy a suitcase or any kind of a travel bag. The old torn sheet was all that he could afford. Gopal tried to calm down and sleep. They would have to wake up early and start their long trek home. All that Mahesh and Gopal now desired was to go back home to their village, to their family, to their home, and to that familiar courtyard. As he lay there in the dark, Gopal began to think about why he left home. The drought. They were farmers. That year there was a severe drought, and all his family members, including the neighbors, kept telling him, "Go to Bombay and earn a living. Bombay, Bombay. That's where you'll make your living. Go. Leave. Find some kind of a job and try to support your family." The drought had been severe that year, and his father could not farm the land. His father, his mother, his two brothers, and two younger sisters were all there back home. He wondered what they were doing there in that little courtyard. Were they worried about him? were they wondering if he would ever come back home. And of course, his biggest desire to go back home was that his Rekha, his beautiful Rekha, she would be also there waiting for him in their courtyard. They got married last year. Yes, like every other marriage in the village, it was arranged. But the good thing was that he knew Rekha since she was a little girl. Their families were old friends, and when it was time for him to be married, his uncle suggested that Rekha would be a good match. His Rekha, she was so perfect in every way. And she was a great cook too. He recollected how everything she made was so delicious that it even tasted sweet. Even that spicy pickle that she made, even that had a sweetness to it. That was the magic of Rekha's cooking. He sighed, and he wished that morning would come sooner than expected so he could start his long journey back home. When he arrived here a few years ago, the only job that he could find was as a construction worker, a laborer. It was really hard. Sometimes in the hot summer months, they would have to work 12 to 14 hours. Mahesh had got him the job. Mahesh was a good friend from the village. At last he would be able to get away from this tiresome, heavy work that paid so little, and his thoughts went back to Rekha as he drifted off to sleep. But sleep wasn't his friend tonight. As he lay tossing and turning, he began to think of all the other workers that came from different states. He thought of Ramesh, this laborer that came from Gujarat, along with his family, and now they were just living in a hut by the side of the road. And the images of all his co-laborers began to flash before his eyes. He began to think about how each of these people had come here with a dream to find work, to get paid, but no one had ever told them that their pay would not be enough to buy them a loaf of bread for the day. Nor would they get some clean water, nor even a place to sleep in. And what were they going to do? What was he going to do? He couldn't go back home. They had sold his mother's gold bangles so that they could have enough money to send him to Bombay. He faced a lot of difficulties. Gopal began to think about this disease. Some called it corona, some called it COVID. He was rather confused, but he knew only one thing, that it was consuming lives. People were dying all around him. Some told him it was like pneumonia. He could see there were those that they were coughing, and the disease was being transmitted by proximity. And the older people just died. Hundreds of people were just dying. This had started about 3 weeks ago, he thought, and this disease just started to take its toll. And now no one had any work. They couldn't pay their rent. They didn't feel that they should die of this sickness. They just wanted to go back home. And they didn't know what lay ahead. But people like Gopal, Mahesh, and others like him, all these things were beyond their grasp. The night passed. At the break of dawn, Gopal and Mahesh left their little room. They didn't even lock it. There wasn't anything to rob, and it wasn't their home anyway. It was a so-called place of abode while they worked under the hot sun in grueling conditions as their health faded day after day and took from their bones and their very flesh the desire to live. They didn't have even a rupee or 50 paise, as you would say. Nothing in their pockets. No money to buy a cup of tea, nor even a bottle of water. All they now needed was a miracle of immeasurable strength and favors that would come from heaven's hand, so somehow they could reach their courtyard. Gopal wore his old plastic slippers. He wasn't sure they'd last the journey, and then he smiled. Oh, even if the slippers didn't last, he would go home bare feet. But he was headed home. His kurta and pajama, the shirt and the pants, they used to be white, but he couldn't even tell its color anymore. They had no running water in that room. It was days since he had washed his clothes, and his beard had grown kind of long. It had been about 3 weeks since he had bought a razor to shave. He didn't have the money to buy a blade or a razor. Gopal and Mahesh started to walk towards their final destination, their home. There were no buses and there were no trains. The distance between Bombay to Durjanpur was quite a lot. It would take about 2 days in a train, but they were going to walk and they didn't know if they'd ever make it. They started on their long journey, Gopal and Mahesh, walking towards Durjanpur, their home, hundreds of miles away. It was a dream. Maybe the dream would come true. Maybe he would be able to see his Rekha, his dad and his mom and his brothers and sisters. Maybe he would be able to smell the earth after the rain. They began to meet a lot of people on the way. All these immigrant laborers, everybody wanting to go back home, trying their best to reach home, to reach their courtyard. Home, home, that's what he was thinking about. That courtyard, whether it was 1,000 miles away or a mile away, even in a different village or in a different country. Your home was your home, the courtyard was your courtyard. You could laugh whenever you wanted, cry whenever you could. Everything was your own. The little sapling growing in the corner of the courtyard. He thought of that swing on that old tree in the courtyard. And the sun started to beat down as they're walking. And he started to break out in a sweat. And he looked down at his feet and saw the slippers were about to break. But Gopal didn't have any trouble in leaving everything behind. But he was like all the others, walking home, making this huge journey, because somehow in their hearts they carried a dream, and every step brought them closer to their dream. With this dream in his heart, he had the strength to take one more step, and then one more step, and another step towards my Rekha, he thought, towards my mom and dad, towards my home, my courtyard. And in this crowd that were pressed around him, there were people like his father and his mother, like his wife, like his brothers and his sisters, all laborers. Some worked in houses, cleaning or cooking meals for the rich. Some worked at gas stations. Some just worked cleaning toilets and cleaning the streets. Some of them would be working in the roadside cafeterias, those little shacks by the side of the road, making as little as $1 a day or 50 cents. Gopal continued on his journey, one step at a time. Every step took him away from that city that never really saw him. He was going far away from that city that never ever stopped and asked him, "How are you?" He was going away from the city, this city, where no one knew his name. Away from this city, where no one knew whether he had a Rekha or a mom and a dad and his 2 brothers and sisters. There were going to be a lot of hurdles ahead, like mountains. But Gopal, he was brave, one step in front of the other. He kept walking. In a few hours, his slippers broke, and he left those slippers there by the corner of the street. This was his identity, along with all the garbage in the city. His slippers stayed there. But Gopal, tired, hungry, thirsty, under the hot sun, kept walking, because somewhere far away, his mom and his dad his brothers and sisters, his Rekha, the goat, his dog. He could hear them all. And he somehow felt all these voices rolled into one were in the courtyard of his house, calling him home, sweet home.